The rich tech chief threw the thick document onto the wood desk, her voice dripping with pure venom while looking down on the worker holding his mop. "You think my expensive crew is some joke? Decode this text, my income is yours." She thought he must shrink, beg for forgiveness, then scurry out of the room. But the loan provider quietly undid his dirty blue shirt, picked up red ink, then voiced the obscure complex rules with terrifying perfection. The room went completely silent. The fluorescent lights of the 44th floor buzzed with a low clinical hum that sounded like a flatlining heartbeat. To the high-powered executives of Holloway Global Systems, that hum was just ambient noise. But to Nathaniel Callahan pushing a 30-gallon commercial mop bucket over imported Italian marble, it was a reminder of time slipping away. It was 10:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. At Chicago's Memorial Children's Hospital, 6 miles west of the skyscraper, a nurse was likely checking the IV drip on his 6-year-old daughter, Maya. Nathaniel had calculated his schedule down to the minute finish, cleaning the executive suites by 1 a.m., catch the night bus down Michigan Avenue, sleep 3 hours in the rigid plastic chair beside Maya's hospital bed, wash up in the public sink, and report to his second job at the logistics warehouse by 6 a.m. Nathaniel was 34 years old, though his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass panes showed a man who looked closer to 45. His jawline was lined with dark stubble. His knuckles were scrubbed raw from industrial-grade ammonia, and the faded gray name patch stitched over his left breast simply read, Nate, Maintenance. Nobody asked for his last name. Nobody asked why a man cleaning toilets moved with the terrifyingly deliberate posture of a military tactician, or why his eyes, sharp gray and endlessly observant, lingered on the complex mathematical models and legal drafts left scattered across the whiteboards of the junior analysts. To Holloway Global, Nathaniel was part of the HVAC system essential for basic sanitation, but completely invisible. That invisibility was deliberate. 4 years ago, before Maya's diagnosis of a rare aggressive autoimmune disorder wiped out his life savings, Nathaniel Callahan had not worn a janitor's uniform. He had worn custom-tailored charcoal suits in Geneva, Zurich, and Washington, D.C. He had possessed a security clearance that required deep background FBI investigations, working as a senior linguistic intelligence consultant and geopolitical risk architect for a high-level private intelligence firm. He was one of less than 20 people in North America who could fluently read, speak, and negotiate in archaic high-register regional dialects, specifically complex legal syntax spanning the Caucasus-obscure Central Asian energy arbitration codes and historic Svan-Georgian treaties. But high-level diplomatic consulting required 70-hour travel weeks, unpredictable months spent in overseas safehouses, and unyielding availability. When Maya's mother walked out, leaving Nathaniel with a sick infant and mountains of mounting medical bills, the intelligence world offered no mercy for a single father who needed to be at a hospital bedside by 4 p.m. every day. So Nathaniel walked away. He traded his 6-figure retainer and corporate prestige for a union janitorial position that offered one non-negotiable Miracle Platinum-tier family health insurance that covered experimental immunotherapy treatments without asking questions. He swallowed his pride every single night when he punched his time card. He swallowed it when junior executives barely out of graduate school snapped their fingers to point out a spilled latte on the carpet. Pride did not pay Maya's hospital copays. Humility kept her alive. Tonight, however, the air on the 44th floor felt different. It was heavy, volatile, and suffocatingly tense. At the far end of the hallway, the glass-walled executive boardroom was still blazing with light. Usually the floor emptied by 8 p.m. save for a few overworked corporate lawyers. But tonight, over 24 men and women in tailored designer attire were crowded around the central conference table. At the head of the table sat Genevieve Holloway. At 32, Genevieve was the youngest female billionaire in the tech and energy infrastructure sector. She had inherited a struggling regional telecommunications firm from her estranged father and ruthlessly transformed it into a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure titan. She was known for her uncompromising brilliance, her icy composure under fire, and a temper that could strip paint off walls when her time was wasted. Tonight, her signature composure was visibly fracturing. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, but loose strands clung to her temples. Her eyes were bloodshot, fixated on a thick stack of documents bound in crimson leather sitting at the center of the table. Surrounding her were Holloway Global's top legal counsel, senior financial officers, and a sweating, nervous team of corporate translators flown in hurriedly from New York. Nathaniel kept his head down, wringing out the heavy cotton mop head with the mechanical lever of his bucket. Skirt, skirt. The rhythmic splash of soapy water was the only sound outside the soundproofed boardroom doors. But as he wiped down the exterior glass partitions with a microfiber cloth, his trained eyes couldn't help but track the chaos unfolding inside. Through the glass, he watched Genevieve Holloway stand up, slam her palm onto the polished wood, and point an accusing finger at a man in a rumpled suit, her lead translator. Even through the double-paned acoustic glass, Nathaniel could read her lips clearly. "You are telling me we are blind. We have 3 hours." Nathaniel turned his gaze slightly, catching the reflection of the massive digital projector screen dominating the far wall of the boardroom. Displayed across the screen were scanned pages of a contract written in a distinctive, sweeping Cyrillic-derived script, intermingled with archaic Svaneti legal terminology, a hyper-specific Svan-Georgian dialect used exclusively by the Kura Aris Energy Syndicate, a notoriously secretive consortium controlling the mineral and natural gas pipeline rights across the strategic Southern Caucasus corridor. Nathaniel's hand paused on his cleaning rag. He recognized the script instantly. It wasn't modern conversational Georgian, nor was it standard Russian commercial law. It was a pre-Soviet arbitration dialect, layered with complex idioms, where a single misplaced verb tense could shift the liability of a $5 billion infrastructure failure entirely onto the buyer. He watched as the New York translation team pointed frantically at their laptops, arguing with Genevieve's general counsel. They were drowning. They were trying to feed 17th-century Caucasus customary property law into modern neural network translation software, and the algorithm was spitting out gibberish. Nathaniel felt a brief, distant pang of professional sympathy, but he quickly pushed it down. "Not your world anymore, Nate," he reminded himself, dipping his cloth back into the bucket. "You clean the floors. You get the paycheck. You go to the hospital." He moved toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom to clear the trash receptacles stationed just outside until the glass doors abruptly burst open. "Out! Get out before I have security throw you out!" Genevieve Holloway's voice rang through the corridor like a gunshot. The 3 translators from the elite New York firm stumbled out of the boardroom clutching their leather briefcases and tablets, looking pale and thoroughly humiliated. "Ms. Holloway, be reasonable," the lead translator pleaded, turning back at the doorway. "This isn't standard commercial Georgian. The legal syntax is derived from ancient highland property codes mixed with post-Soviet corporate clauses. There are maybe 3 academics at Oxford and 1 consultant in Vienna who can accurately interpret the indemnification articles without a 2-week review period. You're asking for a line-by-line verification in under 90 minutes. I am paying your agency $40,000 on a retainer specifically so I don't have to hear the word impossible." Genevieve stepped into the doorway, her towering heels adding to her commanding, intimidating height. Her charcoal suit was immaculate, but the sheer desperation in her eyes was unmistakable. "If we do not sign the Kura Aris concession agreement by midnight Zurich time, which is exactly 2 hours from now, the consortium defaults to our competitors at Apex Energy. If Apex gets those pipeline easements, Holloway Global's stock drops 40% at tomorrow's opening bell. We face liquidation within 6 months. I don't need excuses about Oxford academics. I need to know what Clause 48.4 actually says before I risk 10,000 employees' jobs. Then, sign it blind, Ms. Holloway, because no algorithm on Earth can parse that paragraph tonight." The translator snapped defensively, pushing past Nathaniel's mop bucket and storming toward the elevators. Genevieve stood in the doorway, her chest heaving as she watched the elevators chime and swallow her last hope. She looked like a queen watching her citadel crumble around her. Inside the room, her chief financial officer, a balding man named Bradley Kincaid, loosened his silk tie with trembling fingers. "Genevieve." Bradley said, his voice cracking over the speakerphone system that echoed into the hallway. "We have to sign. If we don't execute the document by the deadline, the board will oust you by noon tomorrow. We know the general terms. It's a standard transit fee agreement." "Nothing about the Kura Ara syndicate is standard, Bradley." Genevieve barked, walking back into the room, but leaving the heavy double doors cracked open. "Look at the redlining on clause 48.4. They insisted on inserting that specific paragraph by hand 12 hours ago. Why? Why write an indemnity clause in an archaic Highland dialect unless they are hiding a poison pill?" Nathaniel was currently emptying the wastebasket near the open doorway. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. It was simply impossible not to. As he lifted the plastic liner, his eyes glanced up at the 85-inch 4K monitor hanging on the boardroom wall. Clause 48.4 was zoomed in, displayed in sharp, high-definition contrast. Nathaniel's eyes swept across the sweeping, elegant script. His brain, trained by years of dissecting international espionage traps and diplomatic sleight of hand, processed the syntax effortlessly. He translated the complex idioms in his mind within seconds. "Yt prens audichart, orbidity burrents walihor." Should structural subsidence or seismic disruption occur along the Northern Corridor transit route, the primary operating lessee, Holloway Global, hereby assumes absolute unmitigated financial and criminal liability for all retroactive environmental remediation, forfeiting all rights of international sovereign arbitration. It wasn't a standard transit fee agreement. It was a catastrophic multi-billion-dollar death trap. If Holloway Global signed that document, they wouldn't just be buying pipeline rights. They would be legally binding themselves to pay for billions of dollars in Soviet-era environmental cleanup caused by the syndicate decades ago, completely waiving their right to defend themselves in court. Nathaniel let out a low, involuntary, sharp breath. A tiny, barely audible scoff escaped his lips. It was the natural reaction of a seasoned analyst witnessing an amateur walk directly into a landmine. He immediately caught himself tied the garbage bag with a swift knot and turned to grab his mop handle. "You!" The word cut through the heavy, stagnant air of the boardroom like an icicle. Nathaniel froze. He turned his head slowly. Genevieve Holloway was staring directly at him. Her eyes, dark and stormy with exhaustion and rage, were locked onto his face. She had heard him. In the dead silence of the boardroom, where 12 senior executives sat, paralyzed by fear, the soft scoff of a janitor had sounded like a shout. "Did you just laugh?" Genevieve asked, taking 2 slow, deliberate steps toward the doorway. The room fell so quiet that the humming of the projector sounded like a jet engine. "No. No, ma'am," Nathaniel said evenly, keeping his voice flat, respectful, and entirely devoid of emotion. He lowered his head slightly, playing the part he had perfected for 4 years. "Just clearing the receptacles. My apologies for the interruption." "Look at me," she commanded. Nathaniel raised his chin slightly, meeting her gaze. He didn't shrink back. He didn't tremble like the junior analyst did when she raised her voice. His gray eyes held a steady, calm neutrality that instantly caught her off guard, though she was far too stressed to analyze why a janitor looked at her with the unyielding composure of a 4-star general. "You scoffed," Genevieve said, her voice rising in pitch, fueled by 14 hours of sleepless anxiety and the terrifying prospect of losing her company. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the complex Georgian script on the screen. "You stood there with a garbage bag in your hand and you scoffed at us. Do you find our failure amusing? Do you think it's funny that a $12 billion company is about to go under because not a single Ivy League lawyer in this room can read 3 sentences of script?" "I don't think anything about your company is funny, Ms. Holloway," Nathaniel said softly. "I'm just doing my job." Bradley Kincaid stood up from the table, slamming his pen down. "Throw him out, Genevieve. Jesus Christ, we have 70 minutes left before the Swiss banks close the escrow window. Why are you talking to the cleaning crew?" Genevieve ignored Kincaid. Her frustration had found a focal point, a lightning rod for the crushing pressure threatening to destroy her sanity. She walked right up to Nathaniel, her posture rigid, her tone dripping with biting, desperate sarcasm. "You think our legal team is a joke?" Genevieve mocked, her voice echoing off the glass wall so loudly that even the paralegals in the outer cubicles looked up. She gestured wildly toward the giant monitor displaying the Svan Georgian dialect. Go ahead then, if it's so amusing to you, read it. Translate this, my salary's yours. A few nervous, uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the boardroom from the executives. They were laughing to diffuse the tension, grateful that the CEO's wrath had temporarily shifted away from their own incompetence and onto an ignorant maintenance man who happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Genevieve, sit down, Kincaid muttered, rubbing his temples. Stop playing games with the janitor. Nathaniel stood completely still. He looked at Genevieve Holloway. Beneath her aggressive posture and biting arrogance, he saw the exhaustion. He saw the faint tremor in her right hand. He saw a woman fighting a desperate battle against shadowy international vultures who were trying to destroy her life's work. He glanced up at the clock on the wall, 10:42 p.m. If he let her sign that contract, Holloway Global would file for bankruptcy within a year. Thousands of people would lose their jobs. The union health insurance fund that kept Maya's experimental treatments paid for would collapse. If Holloway Global went under, Nathaniel would lose Maya's lifelines. He looked back at Genevieve. The arrogant, mocking challenge hung in the air between them. Translate this, my salary's yours. Nathaniel slowly let go of the yellow plastic mop handle. It leaned against the wall with a soft click. He reached up to his neck, unbuttoning the top button of his stiff industrial blue uniform shirt. Do you have a dry erase marker? Nathaniel asked. The boardroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence. Genevieve blinked, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She'd expected him to apologize and scurry out into the hallway. She hadn't expected his voice to suddenly shift, losing the deferential, flattened tone of a night shift cleaner and taking on the resonant, authoritative cadence of a seasoned boardroom commander. What did you say? Genevieve breathed. Nathaniel didn't repeat himself. He walked past her, stepping across the threshold of the boardroom. His heavy work boots made no sound on the thick plush corporate carpet. He walked directly past Bradley Kincaid, who stared at him with wide, indignant eyes, and stopped at the head of the conference table. He picked up a thick red dry erase marker lying next to the legal team's abandoned notes. He popped the cap off with a sharp snap. Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? Kincaid shouted, half rising from his leather executive chair. Security! Get security up here right now! Sit down, Bradley, Nathaniel said. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice above a conversational pitch. But the absolute command behind those three words was so intense, so deeply rooted in authority, that Kincaid's knees buckled slightly, dropping him right back into his chair in stunned silence. Nathaniel turned his back to the room, facing the massive 85-inch screen displaying Clause 48.4. He tapped the red marker against the glass screen, circling three specific sweeping words in the middle of the paragraph. Your New York translators failed because they were treating this as standard Cartvellian commercial grammar. Nathaniel spoke clearly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. It's not. This is a hybrid formulation. The structure relies on pre-1917 Upper Svaneti customary law, specifically property dispute syntax used by Highland mining guilds, cross-spliced with modern Swiss arbitration statutes. Every jaw in the room dropped. A senior corporate attorney dropped his gold Mont Blanc pen onto the mahogany table. It rolled off and hit the floor with a loud clatter, but nobody moved to pick it up. Genevieve slowly took 3 steps into the room, her breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Nathaniel circled a specific phrase consisting of 4 archaic characters. Gverdit scala indemnity, he read aloud, pronouncing the complex, throaty Caucasian consonants with breathtaking, flawless native precision. Your algorithms translated this phrase as standard regional transit maintenance. That is incorrect. He turned slightly to look over his shoulder directly at Genevieve. In Svan customary law, Gverdit scala doesn't mean maintenance. It refers to subterranean water contamination caused by deep earth extraction, Nathaniel explained calmly. What this clause actually says, verbatim, is the following. He turned back to the whiteboard next to the screen and began writing out the translation in rapid, immaculate, highly structured legal English. Section 48.4. By executing this agreement, the lessee Holloway Global Systems expressly assumes total retroactive and uncapped liability for all ecological damage, groundwater toxicity, and structural soil collapse occurring across the Northern Transit Basin between the dates of November 1988 and the present. He paused, underlining the final sentence of the translated paragraph with a sharp, aggressive stroke of the red marker. Furthermore, the lessee irrevocably waives all rights to invoke force majeure or appeal to the International Chamber of Commerce in Geneva, agreeing to indemnify the lessor against any pending or future criminal charges levied by the European Environmental Agency. Nathaniel capped the marker. He tossed it onto the polished mahogany table where it slid across the wood and stopped mere inches from Genevieve Holloway's trembling fingers. "If you sign that document at midnight, Ms. Holloway," Nathaniel said softly, looking her dead in the eyes, "you aren't leasing a natural gas pipeline. You are legally absorbing $12 billion in Soviet-era environmental liabilities that the Kura Aris Syndicate has been secretly hiding from European regulators for 30 years. They know the European Union is about to indict them next month. They are using this contract to make you their corporate scapegoat. You sign that, and Holloway Global is bankrupt by Friday." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the blood rushing in your own ears. Bradley Kincaid sat frozen, his face drained of all color, looking like a man who had just watched a ghost materialize out of the floorboards. The senior legal counsel hurriedly grabbed his iPad, frantically comparing Nathaniel's English handwritten translation against the structural roots of the document. "My God," the lawyer whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. He's right. Look at the root prefix on the liability clause. It's retroactive indemnification. They literally hid a corporate suicide pill in a Highland dialect." Genevieve stood frozen at the head of the table. Her eyes moved from the terrifying red text on the whiteboard to the man standing before her in a cheap faded blue uniform. The janitor. The man whose name she didn't know. The man she had just publicly mocked in front of her entire executive board. Her throat felt completely dry. Her legs felt weak beneath her. She took a slow, unsteady step closer to him, her eyes searching his face, seeing the sharp intelligence, the hard-earned exhaustion, and the unmistakable posture of a man who had once operated at the highest echelons of international power. "Who?" Genevieve's voice broke. She swallowed hard, trying to regain her voice, her previous arrogance completely shattered into pieces. "Who the hell are you?" Nathaniel reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out his plastic employee ID badge, and unclipped it from his collar. He laid it gently on the table next to the red marker. "My name is Nathaniel Callahan," he said quietly. "I work the third shift maintenance crew. And as for your salary, Ms. Holloway, keep it. Just make sure the company stays solvent. My family relies on the health insurance." He turned around, walked out of the boardroom, grabbed his mop bucket, and wheeled it down the silent, echoing hallway toward the service elevators, leaving the billionaire CEO and her entire board of directors completely stunned, paralyzed, and breathless in his wake. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom clicked shut, but the silence inside remained absolute. It was a dense, suffocating quiet, broken only by the hum of the air vents and the frantic rhythmic tapping of Leonard Hayes's fingers against his iPad screen. Leonard, Holloway Global's general counsel, was a veteran of brutal mergers and corporate litigation. Yet, as he stared at the red, dry erase handwriting left on the whiteboard by a man in a stained maintenance uniform, his complexion shifted from pale to a sickly shade of ash gray. "Leonard." Genevieve Holloway's voice barely rose above a whisper. She stood frozen by the head of the conference table, her hand resting on the polished mahogany where Nathaniel Callahan's cheap plastic ID badge still lay. "Tell me he's wrong. Tell me that was a theatrical stunt." Leonard didn't look up from his screen. He was cross-referencing the English translation Nathaniel had written against the root etymology of the pre-Soviet clauses in international trade databases. "He isn't wrong, Genevieve," Leonard said, his voice trembling so violently he had to set his tablet flat on the table. "I just ran the root syntax through the European Court of Arbitration's historical registry. The phrase gverdit skala, our New York team, pulled it from a standard contemporary dictionary. But in Highland legal covenants prior to 1924, it explicitly designates subsurface mining runoff. If we had signed this document as drafted, we wouldn't just be buying transit easements. We would have formally submitted Holloway Global as the primary guarantor for 35 years of toxic industrial waste dumping across the entire southern Caucasus. A collective gasp rippled around the table. Several board members sank back into their leather chairs, visibly shaken. $12 billion in remediation. Leonard continued wiping cold sweat from his forehead. And because of the jurisdictional waiver in Clause 48.4, the moment our digital signature hit the Zurich escrow server, our corporate accounts would have been frozen by EU regulators to secure the environmental bond. We would have been insolvent by Friday morning. We would have had to liquidate the company to pay fines for crimes we didn't commit. Genevieve felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The breath hitched in her chest. She looked down at the plastic ID badge. Nate, Maintenance, Employee ID 884-019. She had looked him dead in the eye just 10 minutes ago and offered him her salary as a joke. She had mocked him to inflate her own ego while drowning in panic. And in return, he had casually reached out, grabbed the steering wheel of her sinking $12 billion empire, and yanked it away from the edge of a cliff before picking up his mop bucket and walking out. Who vetted this contract? Genevieve snapped her icy composure, snapping back into place, replaced by a cold, terrifying fury. She turned her gaze toward Bradley Kincaid, her chief financial officer. Bradley, you pushed for this concession agreement for 3 months. You insisted we bypass our standard 2-week external audit because Kura Aris demanded speed. Bradley swallowed hard, tugging at his loosened silk tie. Genevieve, let's not point fingers in a crisis. The consortium assured us it was boilerplate language. We were under immense market pressure from Apex Energy. Shut up, Genevieve ordered, her tone cutting through him like a blade. She turned to her vice president of human resources, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Dunn. Patricia, access our employee database right now. Pull up everything we have on employee 884-019. Nathaniel Callahan. I want to know who is working on my night shift. Patricia opened her encrypted laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. For 40 seconds, the room waited in agonizing tension. Then, Patricia stopped typing. She blinked, leaned closer to her screen, and pressed the refresh key twice. Ms. Holloway, Patricia said slowly, her brow furrowed. This doesn't make any sense. Read it, Genevieve demanded, stepping around the table to stand over Patricia's shoulder. According to HR records, Nathaniel Callahan was hired 4 years ago through Local 32, the Service Workers Union, Patricia read. Base salary $22 an hour, assigned to third shift janitorial and HVAC maintenance. But look at his pre-employment background check. Genevieve leaned down. On the screen, the standard background verification fields, education, previous employment, credit history, criminal record, were not just blank. They were overridden by a series of high-level digital seals. Where his university education should have been listed, a bright red banner read, Restricted Department of State /Tier 1 Personnel Data Clearance. Where his previous 10 years of employment should have been documented, a single line of uneditable administrative text appeared, Verified Employment. Aegis Strategic Initiatives, Global Risk Consulting. Record sealed under Federal Privacy Act Section 8. Aegis Strategic Initiatives. Leonard breathed, leaning across the table to stare at the screen. Good God, they don't hire normal consultants, Genevieve. Aegis is the private intelligence firm sovereign governments hire when diplomatic backchannels break down. They negotiate hostage releases, structure black budget resource treaties, and handle high-threat sovereign debt redlining. Their senior analysts charge $5,000 an hour just to read a brief. Genevieve looked at the screen, then back at the red dry erase marker lying on the table. A man who used to operate at the highest, most secretive tiers of global diplomatic intelligence was cleaning the toilets on her 44th floor for $22 an hour. She glanced at the digital clock on the wall, 10:54 p.m. We have 66 minutes until the Zurich banking window closes. Genevieve said, her mind racing with calculated precision. If we miss the deadline without a signed agreement or a legally binding counterproposal, our stock plummets at the opening bell and the board will vote me out by noon. But if we submit a counter-contract, one written in their exact obscure legal dialect that strips out the poison pill and turns the trap back on Kura Aras, we secure the pipeline easements and save the company. Genevieve, that's impossible, Leonard said helplessly. Even if we knew how to draft a counter-indemnity clause in Highland Svan Georgian syntax, it would take a specialized legal team a week to write it tightly enough to survive Swiss arbitration. "We don't have a week," Genevieve said, grabbing Nathaniel's ID badge off the mahogany wood and curling her fingers tightly around it. "And we don't need a team. We have him." Without another word, she turned on her heels and sprinted toward the boardroom doors. "Genevieve, where are you going?" Bradley Kincaid called out, standing up. "To find my janitor," she shouted back over her shoulder, slamming the heavy double doors behind her. The subterranean utility level of Holloway Global Systems smelled of industrial bleach-hot copper wiring and damp concrete. It was a world away from the imported Italian marble and panoramic penthouse views of the 44th floor. Genevieve Holloway practically flew out of the service elevator, her designer heels clicking frantically against the raw concrete floor. She ignored the startled looks of two night shift engineers eating sandwiches by the boiler room and headed straight for the maintenance locker rooms at the end of the basement corridor. She found him by the heavy metal time clock near the loading dock exit. Nathaniel Callahan had already changed out of his blue maintenance uniform. He was wearing a faded, heavy charcoal wool coat over a plain black flannel shirt and sturdy work boots. A worn canvas duffel bag hung over his shoulder. He was standing in front of the punch clock waiting for the digital readout to click to 11 p.m. so he could officially stamp his time card without getting docked for leaving early. "Mr. Callahan!" Genevieve called out, her breath coming in heavy gasps as she hurried down the dimly lit hallway. Nathaniel didn't jump. He didn't even turn his head immediately. He waited until the digital clock ticked from 10:59 to 11 o'clock, slid his paper time card into the slot with a sharp cod chunk, placed it back in the rack, and then slowly turned to face her. "Ms. Holloway," Nathaniel said evenly. His posture was relaxed, entirely devoid of the subservient deference he had worn upstairs. He looked at her with the calm, analytical assessment of a man who evaluated threats for a living. "Did I miss a wastebasket on the executive floor?" Genevieve stopped 3 feet from him, flushing slightly at the reminder of her earlier arrogance. She held out his plastic ID badge. "You left this on the conference table," she said softly. Nathaniel looked at the badge, then met her eyes. He reached out and took it, slipping it into his coat pocket. "Thank you. Replacing those costs $10 through payroll." "I know who you are," Genevieve said, cutting straight to the point. She wasn't used to begging, but the clock ticking in the back of her mind stripped away her usual corporate armor. "Or at least I know what you used to be. My general counsel saw your Tier 1 clearance and your employment history with Aegis Strategic." Nathaniel's gray eyes hardened slightly. The shift was subtle, a fractional tightening of his jaw, a momentary stillness in his shoulders, but suddenly standing in the cold concrete basement, Genevieve felt like she was standing in front of a formidable predator rather than a man holding a canvas gym bag. "Aegis was a long time ago, Ms. Holloway," Nathaniel said, turning toward the heavy metal exit doors leading out to the alleyway. "I clean floors now. My shift is over. Have a good night." "Wait." Genevieve stepped directly into his path, blocking the exit door. "I need your help. You read that contract in 90 seconds. You saw the trap when 12 corporate lawyers and a specialized translation team were blind to it. We have 55 minutes before the Zurich escrow window closes. If I don't send back a legally sound counterproposal that neutralizes Clause 48.4, Holloway Global goes under. Thousands of people lose their jobs. Then you should call your lawyers and tell them to work faster," Nathaniel said quietly, stepping around her toward the door push bar. "I have a bus to catch." "I will pay you," Genevieve blurted out, her voice rising in desperation. $500,000, right now. I will wire $500,000 from my personal account into yours tonight if you come back upstairs for 45 minutes and draft a counterclause in that dialect." Nathaniel's hand stopped on the metal push bar. He pushed the door open an inch, letting in a blast of freezing Chicago November air before pausing. He closed the door slowly and turned back to face her. $500,000, Nathaniel repeated, his voice utterly flat. "You think everything in this building is a transaction you can solve by throwing your checkbook at it?" "Isn't it?" she challenged, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. $500,000 would change your life, Mr. Callahan. Why are you walking out that door?" Nathaniel looked at her for a long, heavy moment. Then he raised his left arm, pulling back the sleeve of his heavy wool coat to reveal a cheap, battered digital watch. "It is 11:02 p.m., Nathaniel said. The number 33 night bus passes the corner of Michigan and Adams in 4 minutes. If I catch that bus, I arrive at Memorial Children's Hospital by 11:25. That gives me exactly 3 hours and 35 minutes to sit beside my 6-year-old daughter Maya while she sleeps after her chemotherapy session before I have to leave to start my 6th shift at the distribution warehouse. Genevieve froze. The words hung in the frigid air between them like a physical weight. Maya has a rare autoimmune disease. Nathaniel continued, his tone devoid of self-pity, delivering the facts with brutal clinical precision. 3 years ago, when she got sick, my consulting work with Aegis required me to be in Almaty or Vienna for months at a time. Private intelligence doesn't grant FMLA, leave for single fathers, and independent contractor insurance caps out after the first round of experimental biological treatments. He gestured down at his faded clothes. Local 32 of the Building Maintenance Union negotiates the strongest healthcare contract in the Midwest, Nathaniel said. Platinum tier coverage, no lifetime maximums, no copays for experimental pediatric immunotherapy. Holloway Global pays into that union fund. That is why I clean your toilets, Ms. Holloway. That is why I swallow your executive's arrogance every night, because your company keeps my daughter breathing. Genevieve felt a wave of profound, suffocating shame wash over her. She thought of her earlier words. Translate this: my salary's yours, and wished the concrete floor would open up and swallow her whole. Break. If Holloway Global goes bankrupt, Nathaniel added softly, opening the metal exit door. The collective bargaining agreement dissolves. The health plan goes into receivership. Maya loses her treatment corridor within 30 days. So believe me when I say I want your company to survive. But I am not missing my daughter's goodnight window for a corporate drafting session. Now, excuse me, I have a bus to catch. He stepped out into the freezing alleyway, the heavy steel door swinging shut behind him. Genevieve didn't hesitate. She threw open the door and ran out into the biting November wind, her designer blazer offering zero protection against the cold. Mr. Callahan! She yelled, her heels clattering against the icy asphalt as she chased him down the alley toward the brightly lit street corner. Nathaniel, stop! He paused at the edge of the sidewalk, turning to look at her as she caught up, breathless and shivering violently. My car is sitting right over there. Genevieve pointed toward a sleek black Lincoln Navigator idling at the curb, its hazard lights blinking softly. Her private driver, Samuel, stood by the driver's door. Samuel can get us to Memorial Children's Hospital in 12 minutes. That's 10 minutes faster than your bus. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes, studying her face under the harsh glare of the streetlights. Come with me, Genevieve pleaded, her voice dropping the last remnants of corporate pride. Ride in the car. Sit with your daughter. I won't interfere with your time with her, but bring my secure iPad. Co-draft the counterclause with me from the hospital room. If we submit it by midnight, Holloway Global stays afloat, your union health fund remains secure, and I will personally guarantee a $5 million endowment to Memorial Children's Pediatric Autoimmune Ward tomorrow morning. Nathaniel stood silently on the cold Chicago pavement. He looked at the idling Lincoln, then at the shivering billionaire CEO standing before him in the wind. Get in the car, Ms. Holloway, Nathaniel said softly, before you freeze to death. Room 412 of Memorial Children's Hospital was illuminated only by the soft, rhythmic green glow of heart monitors and the pale amber light filtering in from the hallway. In the center of the room, surrounded by IV poles and infusion pumps, small, pale 6-year-old Maya Callahan slept soundly beneath a heap of colorful hand-knitted blankets. Her breathing was steady, rising and falling in tune with the soft beep, beep, beep of the telemetry unit. Genevieve Holloway stood motionless near the doorway, holding her breath. She felt entirely out of place in her tailored charcoal suit, surrounded by the quiet, holy struggle of a pediatric recovery ward. She watched as Nathaniel crossed the room with quiet, agonizing gentleness. He didn't look like a high-level geopolitical operative now. He simply looked like a father. He leaned over the bed, pressed his lips tenderly against his daughter's warm forehead, and gently tucked a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. Maya stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. Daddy, she whispered, her voice fragile and sleepy. I'm here, sweetie, Nathaniel murmured, sitting down on the edge of the mattress and taking her tiny hand in his calloused palms. Daddy's right here. You did so good today. Did you finish work? Shift's all done. He smiled softly, a genuine warm smile that transformed his entire face. "Go back to sleep, Maya. I'll be right beside you." Maya nodded barely, her eyes slipping shut again as the sedation pulled her back into peaceful slumber. Nathaniel sat there for 3 full minutes, just holding her hand, grounding himself in the reality of why he sacrificed everything. Then, he gently laid her hand back onto the mattress, stood up and walked over to the small, rigid vinyl visitor chair by the window. He looked at Genevieve and held out his hand. "Give me the iPad." Genevieve hurried forward, placing her encrypted corporate tablet into his hands. She pulled up a steel folding chair and sat beside him, watching intently as his posture shifted instantly back into the sharp, hyper-focused demeanor of a master strategist. He glanced at the time at the top corner of the tablet screen, 11:18 p.m., 42 minutes left. "Let's look at the battlefield." Nathaniel muttered, his fingers flying across the glass screen as he pulled up the full 400-page digital file of the Kura Aras concession agreement. The syndicate knows Holloway Global is desperate for energy infrastructure. They structured Clause 48.4 using Highland mining terminology, specifically because modern translation algorithms automatically convert archaic agrarian property words into generic commercial terms. "How do we beat them without voiding the easement rights?" Genevieve asked, leaning in close, her eyes tracking his rapid scrolling. "We don't just strike the clause," Nathaniel said, his gray eyes flashing in the dim screen light. "If we simply delete the indemnity paragraph, their automated escrow system in Zurich will reject the contract filing on structural mismatch. We have to use their own dialect against them. We execute a linguistic reverse indemnity trap." He opened the drafting document, split-screening the original Georgian script alongside his blank text box. "Who is Kura Aras's legal signatory?" Nathaniel asked. "A holding entity registered in Zug, Switzerland," Genevieve replied immediately. "Managed by a senior broker named Viktor Baranov." Baranov. Nathaniel murmured, a dark, knowing smile touching his lips. "I dealt with Viktor Baranov in Baku 6 years ago during the Caspian Sea Shelf negotiations. He's an arrogant shark. He relies on sheer volume and obscure local statutes to blind Western corporate lawyers. He won't read our counter-submission line by line tonight because he assumes your legal team is still panicking over standard dictionaries." Nathaniel began typing. His fingers moved across the digital keyboard with breathtaking speed, constructing complex, sweeping Svan Georgian script directly into the document amendment window. "Watch this structural root," Nathaniel whispered, pointing to a cluster of characters he had just generated. In their draft, they used the phrase "tsika didi obligation," which binds the operational lessee to absolute historical liability. I am changing 2 grammatical suffixes here, shifting the tense from active assumption to conditional reversion. "What does that do in legal terms?" Genevieve asked. "It alters the legal definition of the corridor." Nathaniel explained, his eyes locked on the screen. "Under Swiss banking compliance laws, specifically, Article 102 of the Federal Act on Financial Institutions, any entity attempting to transfer unremediated environmental liabilities through concealed dialectology automatically forfeits their underlying asset security." He highlighted the amended paragraph, inserting it smoothly into Section 48.4. "I am writing a counterclause that states, should any undisclosed environmental toxicity or historical contamination exist along the northern transit basin, the lesser Kura Aras not only retains 100% financial and criminal liability, but immediately forfeits all physical pipeline easements and infrastructure rights to the lessee Holloway Global for the sum of 1 symbolic Swiss franc as compensation for fraudulent conveyance." Genevieve stared at him, her eyes wide with awe. If Baranov signs that, or if his automated escrow server accepts the counterfiling before the midnight deadline, Holloway Global gets the entire pipeline network for free, and Kura Aras absorbs $12 billion in European environmental fines, Nathaniel finished quietly. He hit the save and encrypt command. Suddenly, Genevieve's cell phone buzzed violently in her jacket pocket, the screen illuminated with an urgent incoming call, Leonard Hayes, General Counsel. She swiped to answer, pressing the phone to her ear while keeping her voice low so as not to wake Maya. "Leonard, what's happening upstairs?" "Genevieve, where the hell are you?" Leonard's voice came through the receiver, tight with panic. Bradley Kincaid has called an emergency quorum of the board members who stayed behind in the boardroom. He's panicking. Baranov's representatives in Geneva just sent a formal notice saying that if we don't execute the original contract in the next 10 minutes, they are transferring the pipeline rights to Apex Energy immediately. "Tell Bradley to stand down," Genevieve hissed. "He won't listen," Leonard urged. "Bradley is telling the board that your refusal to sign is a dereliction of fiduciary duty. He's petitioning the board to use their emergency bylaws to override your executive authority and authorize the digital signature on the original poison contract right now." Nathaniel stopped typing. His eyes darted to the phone. He leaned in close to Genevieve's receiver. "Why is your chief financial officer so desperate to sign a corporate suicide pact?" Nathaniel asked aloud, his voice cold and analytical. Genevieve blinked, her mind racing as she processed his words. "What do you mean?" "Baranov doesn't work alone," Nathaniel said, his tone dead serious. "An obscure Svaneti dialect trap only works if the target company is pressured into signing blind at the 11th hour. Who created the artificial urgency? Who insisted on bypassing the 2-week external legal audit? Who brought Kura Aras to your table in the first place?" Irfantir. The realization hit Genevieve like a physical blow to the chest. Her face hardened into pure marble. "Bradley," she whispered. "Bradley orchestrated the deal from day one." "He's on Baranov's payroll," Nathaniel confirmed, looking at the clock on the tablet. 11:34 p.m., 26 minutes remaining. "If Bradley forces that signature through the board right now, Holloway Global dies by morning." Nathaniel turned the tablet toward her, displaying the fully amended, hyper-encrypted counter-contract. The complex Svan-Georgian script glowed on the screen like a weapon primed for detonation. "The counter-concession is drafted, sealed, and formatted for the Zurich portal," Nathaniel said, standing up from the vinyl chair and looking down at her. "You need to initiate the digital confrontation before Kincaid hits execute. Call him." The digital clock on the iPad read 11:36 p.m., 24 minutes until the Zurich escrow portal permanently locked. Genevieve snatched her cell phone, stabbing the speakerphone icon and dialing directly into the 44th floor boardroom's central communication hub. The line connected with a sharp electronic chime, immediately broadcasting the chaos unfolding miles away at Holloway Global headquarters. "I am telling you, we are facing total liquidation by tomorrow's opening bell." Bradley Kincaid's voice was hysterical, echoing through the hospital room's tinny phone speaker. Genevieve has suffered a complete psychological breakdown. She ran out of the building with the janitor. Under Article 12 of the corporate charter, the executive quorum has the legal authority to bypass the CEO in the event of incapacitation. I am moving for an immediate vote to digitally execute the Kura Aras contract. "Bradley, you cannot invoke Article 12 without a medical proxy," Leonard Hayes shouted back, the general counsel's voice tight with mounting panic. "You are attempting a hostile coup with 20 minutes left on the clock." "Anda, Nico." "I am attempting to save this company from a woman who is consulting a toilet scrubber for legal advice," Kincaid roared. "All in favor of executing the signature, raise your hands. The escrow server is waiting." Genevieve's knuckles turned white as she gripped the phone. She opened her mouth to scream an order, but before she could utter a single syllable, Nathaniel gently took the device from her hands. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He leaned over the phone, his voice dropping into the terrifying, icy baritone of a man who used to extract confessions from international arms dealers in windowless rooms. "Mr. Kincaid," Nathaniel said softly. The sheer unnatural calm in his voice cut through the boardroom's screaming match like a scalpel. Total silence fell over the speakerphone. "Mr. Callahan," Leonard Hayes asked hesitantly. "Leonard, do not authorize that vote." Nathaniel commanded, his eyes locked on the iPad screen where the Kura Aras counter-contract was fully compiled. "Listen to me very carefully. Bradley is pushing this signature because he knows what the Svaneti dialect trap says. He knows Holloway Global will be rendered insolvent by the European Environmental Agency's fines. And he knows that when your stock craters tomorrow, Apex Energy will initiate a hostile takeover for pennies on the dollar." "That is an insane, defamatory lie," Kincaid screamed, his voice pitching up an octave. "Disconnect this call. Security trace this line. Leonard." Nathaniel continued, completely ignoring Kincaid's outburst. Open your laptop, access the FINRA International Wire Registry, run a Tier 3 Swift audit on Bradley Kincaid's secondary offshore disclosures. You can't do that without a subpoena, Kincaid shouted, the raw terror finally bleeding into his tone. This is internal corporate risk mitigation, Bradley, no subpoena required, Nathaniel said smoothly. Leonard looked for a holding shell company in Nicosia, Cyprus, likely registered under the name Cyprus Zenith or something similar, routed through a blind trust at Credit Suisse. Through the speaker, the frantic clacking of Leonard's keyboard filled the tense silence. 10 seconds passed, then 15. My God. Leonard breathed, his voice barely a whisper. There's a blind trust registered in Nicosia, Zenith Fiduciary Holdings. Bradley is listed as the primary beneficiary. And there's a pending escrow deposit of 14 million euros scheduled to clear tomorrow at 9 a.m. The originating entity is Apex Global Infrastructure. Genevieve inhaled sharply. Bradley, you sold us out to Apex for 14 million euros. You set us up to swallow Kura Aris's toxic waste liabilities so Apex could buy our shattered assets for nothing. It's a mistake, a banking error. Kincaid stammered, his chair loudly scraping against the floorboards as he backed away from the boardroom table. Leonard, Genevieve said, her voice turning to pure liquid nitrogen. Call building security. Detain Bradley Kincaid in the boardroom. If he tries to leave, remind him that corporate espionage and conspiracy to commit wire fraud carry a mandatory federal sentence of 20 years. Lock the doors. Done, Leonard said, his tone turning vicious. Bradley, sit the hell down. Nathaniel didn't wait for the boardroom drama to conclude. He picked up Genevieve's iPad, his eyes snapping back to the time, 11:42 p.m. The mutiny is crushed, but the clock is still bleeding, Nathaniel said, turning the screen toward Genevieve. Baranov's escrow server in Zurich requires biometric CEO authorization to accept a counterfiling. You need to log into the portal. Genevieve wiped a cold bead of sweat from her temple. She took the iPad, her thumb pressing firmly against the biometric scanner. The screen flashed green. Identity verified. Genevieve Holloway, CEO. The file is loaded, Nathaniel said, pointing to the encrypted Svan-Georgian document resting in the outbox. The trap is set. Viktor Baranov assumes he broke your legal team. He assumes you are submitting the original contract in blind desperation to save your stock price. He will not run a syntax audit on a file he believes he wrote. When you press send, the counter-indemnity clause becomes binding under Swiss arbitration laws the second his server issues a receipt. Genevieve looked at the sleeping form of Maya, then up at Nathaniel. The janitor who had single-handedly dismantled a multi-billion-dollar corporate conspiracy in less than an hour from a rigid vinyl chair in a pediatric ward. She pressed her finger against the screen. Submit. The progress bar on the iPad screen began to fill, encrypting, routing to Zurich escrow portal, authenticating digital signatures. The clock ticked to 11:45 p.m. Now, Nathaniel whispered, leaning back in his chair. We wait for the guillotine to fall. The next 14 minutes were the longest of Genevieve Holloway's life. She sat completely motionless in the dim hospital room, the only sounds being the soft breathing of the little girl in the bed and the distant muted chime of the pediatric ward's intercom. Nathaniel sat beside her, his posture entirely relaxed, a stark contrast to the absolute warfare he had just unleashed on the global energy market. What happens if Baranov reads it? Genevieve whispered, breaking the heavy silence at 11:52 p.m. What if he has a translator sitting next to him? He doesn't, Nathaniel said with total certainty. Viktor Baranov is a creature of ego. I sat across from him during the Caspian pipeline negotiations. He considers Western executives to be soft, predictable, and heavily reliant on algorithms. His entire strategy hinges on the assumption that you are currently weeping in your boardroom, signing the paper just to survive the night. He is already drinking champagne. 11:56 p.m. Genevieve's phone, still connected to the boardroom, broadcast the absolute dead silence of the 44th floor. Even Bradley Kincaid had stopped protesting, likely realizing that calling his lawyers would require explaining why Apex Energy was wiring him 14 million euros. 11:58 p.m. The iPad screen remained locked on a gray loading screen, awaiting counterparty receipt verification. Come on, Genevieve muttered, her leg bouncing anxiously. 11:59 p.m. Nathaniel reached out and placed a steadying hand on her wrist. Breathe. 12 a.m. The iPad let out a sharp, resonant chime. The screen flashed brilliantly white before resolving into a stark, undeniable confirmation page bearing the official watermark of the International Chamber of Commerce and the Swiss Federal Banking Commission. Document executed, escrow locked, binding receipt issued. Genevieve stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He accepted it. He didn't just accept it, Nathaniel said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He automated his system to auto-accept the incoming signature, assuming it was his own document. He just locked Kura Aris into the counter-contract. On the speakerphone, Leonard Hayes let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Genevieve, we just got the automated ping from the Zurich registry. The contract is live and binding. Read the active asset transfer, Leonard, Nathaniel ordered. There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of Leonard rapidly clicking his mouse. Holy Mother of God, Leonard's voice echoed through the hospital room, vibrating with absolute awe. Under the revised clause, 48.4, the Kura Aris Syndicate has officially assumed 100% liability for all retroactive environmental toxicity. Because this liability triggers an immediate default under Swiss banking compliance laws, the entire Northern Transit Basin pipeline infrastructure has just been legally forfeited to Holloway Global Systems. For how much? Genevieve asked, a fierce, triumphant grin finally breaking across her face. 1 Swiss franc? Leonard shouted, the boardroom behind him, erupting into a frenzy of cheers, clapping, and the distinct sound of Bradley Kincaid sobbing into his hands. Genevieve, you just acquired a $12 billion energy pipeline network for 89 cents. No, Genevieve corrected softly, looking directly at Nathaniel. I didn't acquire it. Mr. Callahan did. She picked up the phone. Leonard, have corporate security escort Bradley Kincaid down to the lobby and hand him directly over to the Chicago FBI field office. Forward the FINRA Swift audit to the SEC whistleblower division immediately. Apex Energy wanted a war, let them fight the federal government. Fight the federals? With pleasure, boss, Leonard replied. Genevieve hung up the phone. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright for the last 18 hours finally began to crash, leaving her breathless, exhausted, and overwhelmingly victorious. She set the iPad down on the small rolling hospital table. She looked at Nathaniel. He hadn't cheered. He hadn't celebrated. He simply stood up, walked over to Maya's bed, and adjusted her blankets, making sure her IV line wasn't pinched. The multi-billion-dollar empire he had just secured was entirely secondary to the 6-year-old girl sleeping soundly in front of him. You saved my company, Genevieve said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved thousands of jobs. You saved my life's work. I don't even know how to begin to repay you. Nathaniel turned around, his hands tucked into his pockets. You already promised how you would repay me, Ms. Holloway. A $5 million endowment to the Memorial Children's Pediatric Autoimmune Ward. That keeps this clinic open. That keeps Maya's treatments funded. We are entirely square. Genevieve stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in her ruined designer suit. A promise is a promise. The transfer will be authorized by 8 a.m. She hesitated, looking at the faded gray name patch on his uniform coat sitting on the chair. But you can't honestly expect to go back to mopping the 44th floor tomorrow night. I have a union contract, Nathaniel said dryly. It has a great dental plan. Nathaniel. Genevieve stepped closer, her eyes blazing with absolute sincerity. You are one of the most brilliant strategic minds I have ever encountered. You humiliated Viktor Baranov and dismantled a corporate espionage plot in 45 minutes using a dry erase marker and an iPad. I am not letting you anywhere near a mop bucket ever again. I told you, Nathaniel said, his tone hardening slightly. I cannot work 80-hour weeks. I cannot fly to Geneva. I have a daughter who needs me here every single day at 4 p.m. I own the company, Genevieve said firmly. I make the rules. She reached into her briefcase, pulled out a gold Mont Blanc pen, and set it on the table. Mars. I am creating a new position tomorrow morning, Genevieve stated. Executive Vice President of Global Geopolitical Risk and Strategic Acquisitions. The starting base salary is $4 million a year plus equity. You will have full platinum health coverage. But more importantly, your office is wherever you say it is. If you need to work from this rigid vinyl hospital chair for the next 6 months while Maya recovers, then Holloway Global's intelligence division will be run from room 412 of Memorial Children's Hospital. Nobody will ever question your hours. Nobody will ever ask you to choose between your daughter and your job again. Nathaniel stared at her. For the first time all night, the unflappable former intelligence operative looked genuinely, profoundly stunned. He looked at the sleeping face of his daughter, then back at Genevieve. "Are you serious?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Translate this." Genevieve smiled, her eyes pooling with grateful tears. "My company is yours." The morning sun broke over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant warm golden hue through the window of room 412. Nathaniel awoke in the vinyl chair, his neck stiff, but a profound lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in 4 agonizing years. The heavy, suffocating dread of medical bills, double shifts, and exhaustion had vanished like mist burning off the water. "Daddy?" Nathaniel sat up instantly. Maya was awake, rubbing her eyes with the back of her pale hand. She looked towards the window, her eyes widening. "Who is that?" Nathaniel turned. Genevieve Holloway was standing by the window. She had clearly gone home, showered, and changed into a crisp, elegant white blazer. She was holding a large, brightly wrapped gift box in a thick manila folder. "Good morning, Maya," Genevieve said softly, walking over to the bed with a warm, genuine smile that the corporate world rarely got to see. "My name is Genevieve. I work with your dad." "You work with my dad?" Maya asked, tilting her head. "Do you clean the big buildings too?" Genevieve laughed a bright, melodic sound. She glanced at Nathaniel, her eyes shining with immense respect. "No, sweetie. Your dad is the boss. He cleans up the really big messes that I don't know how to fix. I brought you something." She handed Maya the box. The little girl eagerly tore off the paper, revealing an incredibly intricate, high-end architectural Lego set of the Chicago skyline. Maya's face lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. While Maya eagerly examined her gift, Genevieve turned to Nathaniel and handed him the manila folder. Nathaniel opened it. Inside was a certified bank transfer confirmation. $5 million. Deposited Memorial Children's Hospital. Restricted Pediatric Immunotherapy Ward. Beneath the bank transfer was a pristine corporate contract. Nathaniel Callahan, Executive Vice President, Global Strategy. Verheer. The board unanimously ratified the Cura Aris acquisition at 7 a.m., Genevieve whispered, ensuring Maya couldn't hear the corporate talk. Viktor Baranov's holding company is currently being raided by Swiss authorities for environmental fraud. Apex Energy's stock is in freefall after the FBI arrested Bradley Kincaid at dawn. Holloway Global stock just opened up 32%. Nathaniel looked down at the contract. The terms were exactly as she had promised. Ultimate flexibility, complete medical coverage, unprecedented corporate authority. "There's one condition, though," Genevieve added, leaning against the hospital windowsill. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "The corner office on the 44th floor, Genevieve said. "It has the best view of the lake. It's yours. But I had maintenance remove the carpet and install Italian marble." "Why?" "Because," Genevieve smirked, "I figure if you ever get stressed dealing with our legal department, you might want to push a mop bucket around for old time's sake. Keeps you grounded." Nathaniel Callahan, the ghost of Aegis, Strategic, the invisible janitor of the night shift, let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed off the hospital walls. He picked up the gold pen Genevieve had clipped to the folder, turned to the signature page, and signed his name with a swift, decisive stroke. "I accept," Nathaniel said, handing the folder back to her. Genevieve took the folder, clutching it tightly to her chest. She looked at the man who had saved her empire and the little girl whose life had just been fundamentally secured forever. "Welcome to the executive board, Mr. Callahan," Genevieve said warmly. Huh. "Thank you, Ms. Holloway," Nathaniel replied, sitting on the edge of Maya's bed and helping her open the Lego boxes. "Now, if you'll excuse me, the vice president of global strategy has to help build a skyscraper." What began as an arrogant boardroom mockery ended in the total dismantling of a multi-billion-dollar corporate conspiracy, proving that true brilliance doesn't care what uniform you wear. Nathaniel traded his mop for an executive suite, secured his daughter's future, and reminded everyone that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one nobody notices. If this incredible story of a single dad outsmarting billionaires gave you chills, smash that like button, share this video to remind the world never to judge a book by its cover, and subscribe for more epic real-life drama stories.